Well, good evening, everybody. How are we doing tonight? Welcome to our live review for time period 2. I remembered I'm on time, so we're ready to go. I got a few people in here, and I'm glad you guys can make it. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. I want to give people time to check in if they want and join us live. But tonight we're going to be covering time period 2, which goes from 1607 to 1754, and essentially covering English colonization. That's what the bulk of this time period is. If you have any questions as we go through, feel free to post them in the chat window. Just remember that we're not going to be playing the Yahoo game tonight. Just ask serious questions. And here's the thing. If you guys are asking questions and other people can answer and jump in, feel free to do that, because that just kind of helps me out a little bit so I don't have to keep going back and forth. But it also helps you guys out too, because the more you converse with each other, the more you remember stuff as we go through it all. So, like I said, we're going to be going through time period 2, which goes from 1607 to 1754. And let me get back a screen here. Started on the wrong screen. So, all right. So, 1607, 1754, our focus today is going to kind of start with competition for the colonies. This competition has been going on since, Columbus first arrived. And so we'll briefly touch on the colonial powers that have set up shop here in North America. But then we're going to dive deep into the development of the English colonies. And what you see a lot in this unit, honestly, is the skill of comparing and contrasting, comparing the different colonial regions to one another, comparing their economies, their societies, looking at religion as well. Also, what's their differences? What's the differences between the New England region and the Chesapeake region, because there are distinct differences, and what causes those differences. So we'll be looking at some of that stuff as well. And then we'll start looking at really the development of colonial society during this time period. Some names you might want to be familiar with. You got the John Smiths, the John Winthrops, Anne Hutchinson, Metacom, also known as King Philip, and the people of the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, John Locke is in there too. So there are names that we need to know and be familiar with. The best way to familiarize yourself with who you need to know is go into that AMSCO book and look at the names listed in the vocab. I mean, that's the best way you can review all this information. So we're going to get started here in just a second. I'm going to move this over so I can see all my screens. And so let's get into it. Now, like I did before, I have broken this down into big ideas. The big ideas don't directly line up with the topics in the textbook, but the ideas are the same, because textbooks are going to rearrange topics, they're going to call it something different, but the history remains the same. So just stick with me, because I've been using these topics for a number of years. So we are going to start with big idea number 1, and this is a little bit of review from time period 1, but also kind of brings us into time period 2. That's the colonial powers and why they were motivated to come to North America. So we have the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, and the English all colonizing in North America. And while they all had similar goals, the application of those goals is a little bit different. Just as a recap, the Spanish are going to come in, and what the Spanish are essentially doing is they're looking to conquer the Native Americans. They're looking for wealth, and they want to spread Christianity. We're getting into that, God, glory, and gold. That's the foundational idea. And what that looks like for the Spanish is essentially setting up colonies in the southwest section of North America. They're going to create a labor system called the encomienda system, in which they force the Native Americans into slavery. And then when the Native Americans are lost due to disease, which a lot of them were, they're going to have to look for a new labor force, and that's going to be the African slaves. And so it's going to be the Spanish who introduce African slavery to North America in the early 1500s. I mean, it was relatively quick that they started bringing African slaves over from the African continent. When we look at the societal structure of the Spanish, they've settled most of their communities around missions. You saw they had plantations, they had ranches, they had mines. This is how they were making their money. And their society was based on a caste system. The caste system that started with the Peninsulares at top, followed by the Creoles, the Creoles, the Mestizos, the Mulattoes, the African Americans, and then the natives. That was your caste system. And we studied that in time period 1, and I said that's going to carry over to time period 2 because we're going to see similar structures in English colonial society as well. So there was pushback against the Spanish, obviously, but when we look at their colonial systems, just remember the encomienda system, remember the caste system, and remember the mission system, because I think those are the primary characteristics of the Spanish. Then we go to the French. French had very similar ideas. They were looking for wealth. They were looking for trade partners with the Native Americans. And they also were looking to convert the Native Americans to Christianity. But they had a different way about it. Now, where the Spanish were making their money through agriculture and mining, you're going to see the French start to build their economy on fishing, and fur trapping. And what we'll see as far as their society, mostly trading posts. What's interesting about the French is that their relationship with the Native Americans is completely different. They're going to see the Native Americans as an asset. You'll see intermarriage with the French. You never saw intermarriage with the Spanish. You're never going to see intermarriage with the English, but you absolutely saw that with the French. Because they saw it, like I said, as a mutually beneficial arrangement. So they would marry into Native American tribes. That would allow them to create a alliance, if you will. As far as the natives saw, they were building kinship ties. And so they could then have a permanent trading partner in North America that they could trade their furs with. They could also, their wives would help them find the furs and act as guides throughout the wilderness. So the French relationship with the Native Americans completely different than what we saw with the Spanish. You also had the Dutch come in early in the 1600s, and the Dutch kind of, their main goal was trade. They were trying to build their trade empire in the world, and they were trying to build a commercial empire. A little bit different than what we saw with the Spanish, who wanted to build a military empire. But the Dutch are looking to trade. They're looking at building their economy through shipping, through the fur trade, and through finance. Now, they are going to create a colony in North America called New Netherlands. Their primary city is going to be New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam, as you guys know, will later become the city of New York once the control of that region is transferred over to the English. The relationship with the Native Americans, quite honestly, is pretty minimal. They did trade with the Native Americans. They did, use some Native Americans as guides, but the Dutch were kind of, independent of Native American relationships and stuff like that versus the French and the Spanish. So those were the big colonizing powers that we talked about coming into this unit. But then in the early 1600s, we're going to see the English start to move in. Same type of goals, but application different. Obviously, England is looking to build wealth for their nation. But when we talk about religion with the English, they're not looking to convert Native Americans like the French and the Spanish were. They're seeking an opportunity to worship freely on their own. So they're coming over here to practice their own religion. I do want to say they weren't opposed to converting the Native Americans. It just wasn't at the top of their goals. But, the Puritans, I'm sure that if they could convert Native Americans, they're not going to say no. So though it happened, it wasn't a predominant goal of the English. The English were looking to build wealth. The English was looking to expand their territories. And again, the other part of it was religious freedom for some of the people who wanted to come over here. You also had people coming into the English colonies looking for better living conditions. The conditions over in England weren't that great. Several things were happening within the English society that made it very difficult for you to advance your life. over there. You had the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement was essentially the government was overtaking public lands, which pretty much took away the possibility of land ownership for many, many people in England. So the new colonies are going to offer, a wealth of new land if you can get over here and if you can afford it. The other thing that people in English society were facing was that tradition of primogeniture, the fact that the firstborn son inherited everything from the father. So unless the firstborn son was willing to take care of his brothers and sisters in the family, which a lot of times they did, but when they didn't, those younger brothers saw an opportunity to come over to North America and stake their claim and start to build their own, personal empire, if you will. So all of that is driving, or all of those are motivating factors for people to leave England and come over to North America. When it came to relationships with the Native Americans, I think it was pretty standard that at the beginning, when new colonies were set up, it was friendly at first. But as those colonies started to grow and started to expand, then the tension started to grow, and that's when you started to have wars over that land and over the encroachment of colonies into Native American lands. So that's your overview of the colonizing powers in North America. Talked about the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and now the English. Now we're going to shift from this international view of colonization, and we're going to start to dive into specifically the British. Now, the British, we're going to go here to big idea number 2, where it says that the British colonies in North America differed from each other in their goals, population makeup, and society. I said when I started that this unit has a lot of comparing and contrasting. So when you go back to big idea number 1, make sure you understand the similarities and the differences between the colonizing powers. Now, as we move into big idea number 2, we've got to start paying attention to the differences and the similarities between the colonial regions. We're going to have 4 distinct colonial regions that are going to be developed over the first 150 years of English colonization. In 1607, we're going to see the first permanent English colony, Jamestown, be established. Jamestown is going to become the center of the Chesapeake region. And the Chesapeake region, initially, you had joint stock charters being given to people coming over here. But they're going to, in about 1624, you're going to see those joint stock charters be revoked, and royal charters are going to be issued for these colonies. The colonies of the Chesapeake region are Virginia and Maryland. Just those two, but they're very important. When you look at the growth of Jamestown, we went through a lot of difficulty, a lot of challenges, not being prepared when we first came over here. And then once we established ourselves, we start looking at the economies. What kept the Chesapeake colonies going? And economically, it's going to be tobacco. John Rolfe is going to introduce or come up with a new strain of tobacco, which is going to be in high demand over in England and other parts of Europe. And that's essentially going to become the economic foundation of the Chesapeake region. So when we look at that, economics, Chesapeake, tobacco, cash crops. And just a reminder, cash crops are crops that are grown just to be sold. Politics in the Chesapeake region was essentially centered by 1619 around the Virginia House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses was a representative government that, quite honestly, was made up of mostly the elite planters. But what we see is a start or an example of self-government. And self-government is a thread that is woven throughout this entire unit, the establishment of self-government. So keep that in the back of your mind, because every single colony will have their own form of self-government. When we talk about society, I mentioned those elite planters who made up the House of Burgesses. Well, those elite planters sat at the top of the societal hierarchy, if you will. I talked about the caste system from Spain and the New Spain and their colonial system. You're going to see something very similar in the Chesapeake colonies as well as the Southern colonies and the New England colonies. And at the top of all of these societal hierarchies is going to be the wealthy elite, whether they're planters in the South or they're merchants in the North. It's always going to be the wealthy at essentially the top of the food chain. When we talk about going down that level, especially in the South, you'll go from the wealthy plantation owners to just landowners to the unskilled labor, and then you're going to get down into indentured servants. The very first major labor system introduced in the English colonies is going to be indentured servants. Now, we can quickly do a comparison of England to Spain, because Spain, their first labor system was the encomienda system, which then evolved to African slavery. What we're going to see in the southern, what we're going to see throughout the colonies is a labor system based on indentured servants that will over time evolve into African slavery. Now, if you remember correctly, indentured servants, these are servants who essentially sold themselves into slavery to get passage to come over to North America. It started in the Virginia or in Jamestown colony, and Jamestown is part of the Virginia colony. The Virginia colony grew out of Jamestown. So the indentured servants, it's going to start there, and you're going to see indentured servants being used throughout the colonies. It was a horrible, hard life because you're essentially living in slavery, and a lot of indentured servants didn't make it out of their contract. They died before it happened. But should they get out of that contract, should they make it to the end and are able to purchase their freedom, often they were given freedom dues, which is a plot of land and maybe a little bit of money to get started. And that's why a lot of people did this. This was their only opportunity to come over to the new world and have a chance at a new life. You sell yourself into slavery for 5 to 7 years, and if you can survive, you're promised something at the end. But the promise never really was delivered in full. And we'll talk about that in a subsequent big idea. But essentially what's going to happen is a lot of these indentured servants are going to kind of get the garbage land, the leftover land that doesn't really do them any good if they want to enter into an agricultural economy. Religion in the Chesapeake colonies was primarily Anglican based, so the Church of England, but Maryland was a haven for the English Catholics. And so Maryland is going to offer religious freedom for anybody who's Christian. They were established as a haven for Catholics, but they opened up anybody who wanted to come in who was Protestant. And so religious freedom was present in both Maryland as well as Virginia. And like Virginia had, like I said, more of an Anglican religious background there. One thing you might want to be familiar with as far as Maryland, we're going to see one of the first laws established about the freedom of religion, and that's the Act of Religious Toleration. Sometimes it's called the Maryland Act of Religious Toleration. And it essentially said we're going to tolerate all Christian religions in our colony. And that just opened the door for everybody. The next major region that I want to talk about is the New England region. So Jamestown was founded in 1607. 13 years later, you're going to see the first New England colonists come over, and that's going to be the Pilgrims who were on the Mayflower. And when we look at New England, the primary reason for settling this region was due to seeking out religious freedom. And so you have the Pilgrims who are coming over, and the Pilgrims, half of them who came over were actually separatists. And separatists were people who wanted to completely separate from the Church of England. And that's what they're going to try to do when they come in and land in Plymouth. Now, due to the fact that they didn't meet the requirements of their charter, meaning they were off course, they developed what was called the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was written in 1620, and it essentially set up another system of self-governance in a colony. And in this one, they said they're going to be ruled by majority rule. They're going to have town hall meetings where everyone gets to vote on what happens in the colony and stuff like that. So when we look at the politics of New England, you're going to see self-governing and town meetings. Those are the big two ideas for the New England politics. Economically, it's going to be different in New England. And we got to understand the differences between the economies in the different regions. And these differences are primarily based on their geographic or their environmental conditions. So in New England, or I'm sorry, in Virginia and Maryland, you had fertile soil. You had, geographic and environmental conditions that made growing tobacco, it was perfect for growing tobacco. Well, you move up to the New England colonies, you don't have that fertile soil. Instead, you have very rocky soil and a very short growing season due to the fact that, they had harsh winters and stuff up there. So the colonists going into New England are going to have to find other methods of building an economy. They didn't have fertile soil, but they had a lot of trees. And so due to that, New England is going to base their economy primarily on lumber, shipbuilding, and then because they're on the coast and there's a lot of rivers and stuff that flow through New England, fishing. And then one more other economic source is going to be whaling. So these are how New Englanders will make their money. So it started with the Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1620, but you're going to have another large group come in 1630, and this is going to be the Puritans. Now, the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England, and when they came over, led by John Winthrop, they were coming over to set an example, if you will. John Winthrop is going to give his famous City on a Hill speech. And in that speech, he is talking to the Puritans, talking to the people coming over to his colony to say, hey, this is what we're doing. I'm sorry, just one second. Give me that. Stop it. My dog finds stuff to chew on all the time. So anyway, I apologize. So the City on the Hill speech essentially said, we are going to live as a society where we are all one. We are all united towards the same common goal. And from that came the Puritan work ethic. And so this is how the communities up in New England were essentially developed on this idea of the City on the Hill, a Puritan work ethic. We're all in this together. We're all contributing to the community. We're not independent of one another. We are unified. They still practiced. They had the town meetings. They still had, some democratic and self-governing actions and stuff like that. But in New England, there were restrictions to who could participate, because what John Winthrop created was a religious commonwealth where you had to be a member of the church in order to be part of the political community. Other things you might want to know about the New England colonies: families. They attracted mostly families coming in, so it was very family-centered communities, as opposed to the Chesapeake region, where it was mostly men coming in here. They're going to strike their gold and they're going to make money. I mean, there were still families in the Chesapeake region, but not as prevalent as what you saw up in New England. All right, so that's a quick overview of the New England territory. New England, the colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. Those 4 colonies make up the New England region. Now we're going to move down to the middle region, the middle colonies. The middle colonies were founded, honestly, these were proprietary colonies, meaning that most of the colonies had an economic focus when they were developed. Now, economics was a focus, but religion played a key role as well. William Penn is going to have the Holy Experiment in Pennsylvania. He creates the Pennsylvania colony as a haven for Quakers, but he's going to open up the colony to all religions. So here we have more religious freedom throughout Pennsylvania. The other colonies in the middle colonies include, we got Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. Their economy was based on agriculture. They have a shorter growing season than the Chesapeake colonies, longer growing season than what they have in New England. And what it's perfect for is cold weather crops. which are like wheat and barley and oats and other grains. And cold weather crops are like they have a shorter growing season. And so what's going to happen is you're going to see the middle colonies, which will become known as the breadbasket colonies, start to build their economy on growing these grains, but also trade. Because within the middle colonies, the geography of that region, fertile soil, but also lots of rivers, which is going to make it easy to transport their goods, away from the farmlands and stuff over to the deep water ports that are also part of the middle colonies. So trade is a big part of their colonial region as well. Finally, the other thing, let me talk about Carolina and then I'll circle back. The Carolinas, or the rest of the southern colonies, are going to be established as also proprietary colonies, there to make money. And agriculture is going to be their number one economic foundation. And when we get down into the Carolinas, you are going to see some tobacco being grown, but the further south you move into what is modern day South Carolina, you're going to see rice become the predominant cash crop of South Carolina. When you look at the society of the southern colonies, the Carolina primarily, you have mostly wealthy landowners, land gentry, guys, especially in South Carolina where you're going to have large plantations and stuff like that. I'm going to circle back a little bit. The middle colonies, I didn't really talk about their society. I talked about families coming into New England. You're going to have families coming into the middle colonies as well. And the middle colonies are very diverse. You're going to have not only people coming over from England, you're going to see people coming over from Germany. You're going to see people coming over from Scandinavia, and the Dutch are already there, and the Scot-Irish are going to be coming in. So it's going to become a very diverse colonial region. Now, I'm going to talk more about labor in a little bit, but I mentioned that in the Chesapeake colonies, we went from indentured servitude to African slaves. You are going to see African slavery throughout all 13 colonies. And I don't think I have a map here. Maybe I don't. No, I don't have my map. So if you picture the map, or if you look at the map of the colonies in your book, what I want you to imagine is if you were going to shade that map, as far as the density of slave population, it's going to be lightly shaded up in New England, but the further south you move, the darker the shading becomes, because slavery becomes more predominant as we get into the southern colonies, because the labor needs of what was needed down there. You didn't need as much labor up in the New England colonies. The middle colonies, you absolutely had slavery there. You saw a lot of the slaves working in the port cities, but they were also working on the farms as well. And then, of course, as you make your way down into the plantation areas of the Chesapeake and the southern colonies, you're going to see a much higher density of a slave population. But that is not going to really happen until the late 1600s. And we'll talk about that. We'll review why again in about 10 or 15 minutes as soon as I get to that. So there are your four colonial regions. Make sure you understand the reason for the motivation for why they were founded. Make sure you understand the economies and why they had different economies, and it's primarily based on their geography and their environment. And look at the different societies and religion as well. Freedom of religion existed throughout all of the colonies. We don't talk about it like in the Carolinas or anything like that, but it existed there. And in all honesty, where we don't talk about it, that's where you see more of an Anglican influence. The Church of England. These are people who practice their faith from the Church of England. Okay. All right. Let's move on to big idea number 3, and this one is a big idea. I swear I heard my dog chewing up more paper. But hey, get out of there. Go lay down. All right. So what kept colonization viable was the great wealth being generated by the transatlantic trade. I have said this numerous times, and I'll say it once again. If England was not making money, they would not have sustained the colonies. The colonies would have ceased to exist. So what we're talking about here is this idea of mercantilism. Okay? Mercantilism essentially is when a nation's, it's an economic system where its nations export more than they import. And I'll break that down and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail, because essentially what's going on in the world right now is, here's a great question. Did slaves up north have a system almost like, Julianne, it's a great question. Most of the slaves, when they came in, especially 1619 to about, 1650, 1660, they were treated primarily like indentured servants. So they were given their freedom. And you saw, them working alongside white indentured servants, and they would, but it's not going to be until we start seeing some of the slave revolts that you're going to see more and more slave laws being created. And when those slave laws are created, they are created with the intention of creating a division between the races. And we'll talk about that. But yeah, that's a great question. The simple answer is yes, they had a system just like indentured servants. All right, so back to mercantilism. There is a finite amount of wealth in the world, and the way wealth is measured is with gold and silver. And so essentially, if you think about it, when you export something or when you sell something, you bring in money, you bring in gold. But when you import something, you're essentially buying it, so you're sending gold out. So when we say that we want our exports to be higher than our imports, we want to be selling more of our goods than what we are actually buying. And that will help us build up our cache of gold and silver, to help us get control of the biggest piece of the wealth pie of the world. So that's kind of how you can think about it. Think of a big pie, and that shows all the gold in the world, and you're dividing it up, and you're trying to get the biggest piece of that pie. And that's why mercantilism is so important to all of these colonial empires. So the mercantilism for the English colonies is going to be based on or built on the transatlantic trade. And the transatlantic trade, what that essentially is referring to, is the trade that goes back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. And you probably know that I'm talking about triangular trade. And triangular trade essentially, and I apologize, I thought I had my maps in here. But what triangular trade was, it created a route of trade that went from the Caribbean to North America, coming over to England and Africa, and then back to the Caribbean. So I'm gonna pause for a second. I'm gonna change the screen, and I'm gonna look, because I could have sworn that I had this on my map, the map on here, and I don't. So all right, I lied to you. I'm sorry. So anyway, triangular trade. You got these. Let me get back here. See, now there we go. Triangular trade is you picture this triangle, and it starts in the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean, what they were producing was sugar. And the sugar would be shipped up to North America, to the New England region, where they would distill that sugar and turn it into rum. And then the rum would go over to England, and England would use the rum in Africa to trade for slaves. And those slaves would come back across the Atlantic Ocean, back to the Caribbean, to start producing more sugar. So we went from sugar to rum to slaves, sugar to rum to slaves. Now, this is just one example of the different products that were crossing the Atlantic Ocean. But while it's not important to remember sugar, rum, slaves, it is important to remember this trade route and this triangular trade route, because what started to happen within triangular trade was an economic interdependence, that each part or each corner of that triangle became interdependent on the other parts of the triangle. So without the sugar, the rum never could have been made. And without the rum, there was no way you would have, the trade for the slaves. And without the slaves, there was no way you could grow more sugar. So you had this economic interdependence that's starting to exist between England and the colonies and England. So just they're dependent on one another. Now England's on the better receiving end. They have the top receiving end of all of this, but just recognize that they're all in this together. Triangular trade wasn't just created for England by England. It was created by all parts of the triangle. And the reason why this happened, and just a little extra here, there was a high demand for the commodities that were being traded. Now, in this example, sugar, when Columbus arrived and we discovered that sugar cane was being grown in the Caribbean, he brought that sugar cane back to Europe. And you guys know what a sugar high is all about. And, the more sugar you get, the more sugar you want. And picture, you guys are going to, Dunkin' Donuts and you're going to Starbucks or anything. Picture your coffee without the sugar in it. I would wager a guess that most people put more sugar in their coffee than they do coffee. But what happened was the Europeans, they loved the sugar. And so it became a commodity that there was high demand. The more they got, the more they wanted. And so that high demand commodity is going to drive more and more trade on the triangular trade. It also is going to drive the need for more labor. So the more sugar we're growing, the more people we need to grow it. And so that's going to increase the demand for slave labor, whether it starts with indentured servants or it's African slaves. We need more labor to grow these crops. And you're going to see the same thing happen that what's happening in the Caribbean. You're going to start to see the same thing happen in the southern and the Chesapeake colonies by I would say, more so around 1700. But that's what's driving this whole thing. Now, England is trying to control all this because England's the one who's trying to make all the money. So England is going to essentially try to put some laws to govern this triangular trade. And these are called the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts were put in place so that England benefited from all of this. And they put rules in place like you could only transport goods on English ships. And you had to go to English ports first before you went anyplace else. And certain commodities, tobacco, sugar, they could only go to England. They couldn't go over to Africa first, or they couldn't go, different places. They had to go to England. And so that's how England tried to control all of this trade. But it's difficult. England was making a lot of money, so they're a little bit laxed in their enforcement of these rules. And so what you're going to start to see happening is what's called, or a time period when the colonies are essentially ignoring the rules. And we go into what's called salutary neglect. And salutary neglect essentially means England is not enforcing the laws. Now, I want you to put this in the back of your mind. It's not going to come into play in this unit, and I know your test is on this unit tomorrow, but I want you to think about this for a minute. England has put these laws in place. They're not enforcing them. They're in salutary neglect. England has also allowed all 13 colonies to practice self-government. No one's trying to stop it. There's little hiccups every now and then when England tries to regain control and tries to pull in the reins of self-government. One example of that is when they created the Dominion of New England and they tried to merge all the New England colonies and put a royal governor over them to enforce the navigation laws. But then when the Glorious Revolution happened and William and Mary came in, they kind of pulled back on that and the colonies went back to self-rule. So for the most part, 90% of the time, the colonies are able to govern themselves. 90% of the time, salutary neglect is setting the stage for you can govern yourself. You don't have to follow the laws. Just do you, and we'll do us, and we'll be fine. This is going to have a detrimental effect, have a major effect when we get to time period 3. But it's all, the stage is being set right now for all of this. So that's the Atlantic trade, and that's what's really important. People from West Africa, it was primarily people, Juliana, from West Africa, just because that's the ports of Africa that we went to. That doesn't mean that there weren't slaves coming from other countries, because if you remember correctly, within Africa, the nations within Africa actually had slaves as well. So they might have slaves from the middle part of Africa or East Africa, and then they would sell those slaves to the slave traders in West Africa. But absolutely the predominant ones came from West Africa. So hopefully that answered your question. All right. Mercantilism, done. Let's move on to big idea number 4. If I get to the right screen, big idea number 4 is this. As European colonies became more established, European powers maintained differing policies in their interactions with Native American peoples, which often led to conflict. Okay. There's not, I mean, we know there's going to be conflict with Native Americans. I mean, that's just the norm when the colonizers came in, be it the Spanish, be it the French, be it the Dutch. Now it's the English. And it all, well, the French didn't have as much conflict. I'm sorry, I overstepped there. But the English absolutely did. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that as more and more people came into the English colonies, as the English colonies were experiencing more and more economic success, more and more people started coming, and they start to encroach on Native American lands. And it's a little bit at a time, but we're going to see several different conflicts with Native Americans. And really, I mean, we saw the Powhatan Wars in the early 1620s, from 1622 to, I think, 14 years later, so 1636. Those are going to be the Powhatan Wars that take place in Virginia. The big event, the big thing that happened there was the Jamestown Massacre, and I shared that picture with you of the Jamestown Massacre and what that looked like. And remind me, I got to go back to period 3 because there's something else I need to talk about. But so you had that conflict. You had the Pequot War between the Puritans and the Pequot. That's going to result in nearly the devastation of the Pequot tribe. But the really big one, the one you need to know, is Metacom's War, or also known as King Philip's War. The English name is King Philip's War. The Native American name is Metacom's War. Metacom was a chief of a Wampanoag tribe, and the Wampanoags, just for reference, that's the tribe that Squanto came from in the early 1600s and 1620, who helped the Pilgrims and stuff like that. Life between the colonists and the Wampanoag is not so good anymore. And what's going to happen is, as the Puritans specifically, or the New Englanders, keep encroaching on Native American lands, Metacom, also known as King Philip, is going to build a confederacy of different Native American tribes in the region. He realized that the only way that the English can be defeated is if they all band together. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but he brings together a number of different Native American tribes, and they are going to start attacking English colonial settlements. And they set up an attack on like 54, I think, different English settlements. Now, the British, they have their own Native American ally. They're going to ally with the Mohawk. The Mohawk are part of the Iroquois Confederacy. And so Metacom's War is going to be fought, and essentially it's going to be fought until Metacom is killed. The King Philip's War resulted in thousands of deaths on both sides. And I mentioned to you that in American history, this is the bloodiest war per capita than any other war fought in American history, meaning that the percentage of Englishmen who died, I'm kind of thinking of them as American, but the number of English colonists who died based on their population had the highest ratio than any other war that's been fought on American ground. Metacom's War, why this is important, is because with the victory for the English, that pretty much opened up New England. You're not going to have any more Native American conflict for a while within that region. We still haven't, by this time, guys, we still haven't expanded like all the way to the Allegheny Mountains or anything yet. So we're still in a relatively small area compared to what they would become. But if you think about it, the New England region now doesn't have any Native American threat to stop them from starting to expand more and more. So we're going to see that happen. And we're, and don't worry, we're going to be talking about a lot more Native American conflicts as we go forward. But I think the important thing is Metacom's War opens up New England. The other thing, keep in the back of your mind before we get to the next unit, the English allied with the Mohawk. The English were allied with one of the members of the Iroquois Confederacy, and that's going to play out a little bit in subsequent time periods. Okay. let's get on to the next big idea, because we're doing okay on time. All right, big idea number 5. Wait, I did say I wanted to go back to big idea number 3, and I'm sorry I left this off. One thing about triangular trade that I forgot to mention is the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was that route from Africa to the colonies, the transportation of slaves. And what you need to realize is this was not a cruise. This was not a nice, joyous voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. These folks were treated like cargo, and the slave traders, their goal was to pack as much cargo as they could on the ship. And there's I'm sure you've seen it, there's graphics of the ship where it's just bodies lying right next to each other, shoulder to shoulder, and then head to toe or toe to toe, and as many as we can. And when you got onto these ships, in the bowels of the ship, you would have literally shelving systems, like a bottom shelf, a top shelf, and a third shelf. And there would be people just crammed on all 3 levels of that shelf, of those shelves, and they would be there, I don't know, chained down, 22 hours of the day. And maybe if they were lucky, they were on a ship that they would be able to go up topside at least once a day. But there was a lot of death, there was a lot of disease, just you picture yourself crammed together with even in that situation for 22 hours, and just think about what type of biological experiences you have in a 24-hour period. And that's all happening in the bowels of these ships, on top of seasickness, on top of death, on top of disease. All of that was going on during this Middle Passage. Horrific time for these people, only to be arrived into North America and be put into slavery. So just keeps getting hits, just keep on coming. You know what I mean? All right, big idea number 5. Speaking of all that, all British colonies depended more or less on enslaved African laborers, but some enslaved people actively rebelled against the system. So I mentioned about, the density of slavery as you move further and further south. So the further south you go, the more slaves that are going to be present. As we mentioned earlier, it wasn't originally African slaves. It was originally indentured servants, and indentured servants are going to be the primary labor force really until the 1670s. The reason why slaves, the high demand for slaves in the South, were those cash crops, tobacco, rice, sugarcane in the Caribbean. All of that, it caused the growth of the demand for labor. And because all of those items, tobacco, rice, indigo, sugarcane, all of those were highly demanded commodities over in Europe. So they wanted more and more, and to grow more and more, you need more and more labor. The indentured servants weren't very efficient. And think about it. You have these indentured servants, you only have them for 7 years, and that was the norm. And so you're constantly having new people coming in, and the indentured servants are not, they're dying out too. And there's a limited amount of supply of indentured servants, because quite honestly, once people hear back in Europe how horrible it is as an indentured servant, are you still going to want to sign up? But really, that's all just, that's all, I'm thinking of word. It's all just like subtext. That's not the real reason or the real driving factor of why African slavery became the dominant labor force in the colonies. You have to go to 1676 in Virginia, just outside Jamestown, to understand why African slavery grew when it did, why it did. It's called Bacon's Rebellion. And what you had was Nathaniel Bacon is going to lead a group of farmers. And these farmers were essentially former indentured servants, both black and white, who had been given their freedom dues, and essentially, what they were given to get started was crap. And so they wanted better lands. And they felt that the elite class, the elite planter class, was discriminating against them because they weren't affording them the opportunity to expand west like they had been given in order to get better lands because of the Native Americans on the western lands. Now, what's interesting is Native Americans play a role in this as well, because while there was conflict with Native Americans throughout the colonies, there was also a lot of trade. the trade didn't stop because there was conflict. And what we saw happening was we saw Native Americans who were actually, trading with the colonists in Virginia, and they were trading for European goods, and they were becoming dependent on European goods. And so you have that situation in Virginia at the time. And my gosh, where are you finding all this paper? You are just pissing me off. Oh, stop it. It's like having a little kid who's not getting enough attention. So the gentry, the elites of Virginia are trading with the Native Americans. So that's an economic, I'm drawing a blank. That's economic wealth they're gaining just from trade right there. And so they're not willing to support the westward expansion of some of these farmers. So these farmers, they're going to do it on their own. And what happens is when they start expanding, the Native Americans start attacking their farms. They go to the government and say, hey, what we want you to do is you got to protect us. You've got to protect us from these Native American attacks. And the government, the House of Burgesses, the governor of Virginia says no, because they don't want to mess up their trade relationship. So that's when Nathaniel Bacon is going to organize the farmers, and they are going to start to rebel against the House of Burgesses and the sitting government. And the sitting government, their first reaction is going to be they revoke their right to vote. They say, if you're going to rebel against the government, you're not an upstanding citizen of the colony of Virginia, so you can't vote anymore. Well, that's just going to add fuel to the fire, and Bacon's rebellion is going to turn into a big thing where eventually Jamestown gets burned down. English forces have to be called in to put the rebellion down. A number of the rebellion are going to be put on trial and hung, and the end result of Bacon's rebellion is what the government, what the elite, what they basically said was, this whole deal with indentured servants is just not worth it, because we don't want to bring in more indentured servants and have this problem occur over and over and over again. And so now what we're going to do is we are going to start using more of the African slaves. And then what they're going to start doing is, because of the rebellion, they're going to start passing laws with regards to slaves. So the indentured servants rose up against the government, and so now they're going to bring in slaves. They don't want them to have the power to rise up, so they're going to start passing laws to try to control the slaves. And what they did at this point was they essentially said, we are going to first of all make laws that make slave property. So new laws come in that turn slaves into chattel slavery, which is, chattel means property. And not only that, our slave codes or our slave laws are going to talk about the African slaves. It's going to talk about the color and the race of the slaves and the way they sell it. Because up until this point, black and white, indentured servants have been working and living next to each other. We saw in that video there was marriages and stuff like that. But they had to create a division. They had to essentially control the labor force. So if we divide them by race, we have that societal system where the elite's on top, and then you have the landowners, and then you have unskilled. Well, we're going to put the slaves at the bottom, and those people who once worked alongside them, the poor whites, they are going to see the slaves at the bottom and say, well, I don't want to be at the bottom of this food chain. So as long as I'm white and I'm poor, I'm not doing great, but I'm not at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And slowly but surely you start to see this division in society based on race, and that's because of Bacon's rebellion. And as a result, we're going to see the number of African slaves start to skyrocket and grow, and then more things are going to be produced, and then that's going to raise the demand for more labor and bring more and more slaves, and that just kind of starts to spiral towards African slaves becoming the predominant labor force in the colonies. So did the idea of racial superiority and slavery in the colonies surface after Bacon's rebellion? Yes, it absolutely did. It started a little bit, Juliana, in the 1650s, because there were some earlier slave codes, but Bacon's rebellion was that catalyst, that turning point when things completely shifted. And we start to see, especially the southern colonies, drift away from indentured servitude. We start to see the New England colonies kind of drift away as well. But again, in the New England colonies, you didn't have as high a demand for slavery as you did down in the southern colonies. So you're going to see more and more slave codes being passed as the numbers of slaves start to grow in the Chesapeake and the southern colonies during this time. Doesn't mean that there still wasn't rebellion. The slave codes were put in place to try, and the other thing that the slave codes did was they said that slavery was perpetual. It was a lifetime situation. There's no more of after 7 years you gain your freedom. It's lifetime. And if a woman slave has a baby while enslaved, that baby is now a slave too. So not only has slavery become perpetual, it's also become generational. So this is what they did. They passed these slave codes because of the rebellions. And there's going to be other rebellions. The one you're going to have, the passive rebellion, or the covert rebellion, where we're going to break our tools, we're going to work slower and stuff like that. You also had something very interesting of covert rebellion. What you're going to see, and this is interesting, is the more the slave population grows and you have more and more slaves, there's this thing that I've heard it called covert rebellion. And covert means no one actually sees it. No one actually sees it as a threat to anybody. But what it allows the slaves, because there's so many, they start to maintain their culture. They are still practicing a lot of their cultural beliefs and their religious beliefs. And they're doing it in secret, but they're all doing it. So they worked very hard to maintain that culture and their belief systems. And I don't think I talked about that in class, but that's important to understand with regards to slavery in the southern colonies, is the fact that they were able to hold on and practice their culture even in the midst of being enslaved. And that's why their culture has continued into this day, and they've maintained it until this day. And it's part of American society today. Okay, I think I want to make sure I have everything. Stono Rebellion. I didn't talk about that. That's the big one during this time period. You should know this is when you had slaves who escaped from South Carolina. They're trying to make their way down to Spanish Florida. The further south they travel, the more slaves join them, and the more people they kill. They kill white landowners. They burn businesses. They burn homes. They are eventually put down and captured by the South Carolinian militia. But then the result, the effect of the rebellion, more slave codes, more laws to try to control them even more than they had been before. Okay? All right. I think that's it with this big idea. The last big idea I want to talk about is colonial society both resembled English society and developed its own character. We just talked about this in class, but two movements, very important movements, the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening. I'll hit on the Enlightenment first because I personally think the First Great Awakening has more of an effect on society as a whole. But the Enlightenment was this idea of rational thought coming over from Europe. And you start to see this thought coming over that kind of was supposed to supersede tradition and supersede religious thought and stuff like that. And what we learned in this spread, a lot of it was because of the transatlantic print culture. So remember, we got all this printing being done now because of the printing press from a couple hundred years ago, and ideas are easily spread. And so we're going to see ideas spread both back and forth across the Atlantic. So just like you have the transatlantic trade of commodities, you also have transatlantic trade of ideas. And so the Enlightenment is one of those ideas that is going to make its way over from Europe. And we're going to focus primarily on the political Enlightenment ideas. And we're going to talk about John Locke and his introduction of our natural rights, where he said that all men are born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property that are given to them by God, given to them by their Creator. And it is the government's responsibility to protect those natural rights. That is what he would call the social contract that we had with the government. We are going to allow you to govern us, and in exchange, you are going to protect our rights. That is essentially the role of government, period. That's all government is supposed to be doing, is protecting our rights. And that's what John Locke would say. And so this social contract basically said that we're going to give you the power to govern us, but if you don't do it the right way, if you're not protecting our rights, then we have the responsibility to take the power back from you. So John Locke said the power for governments didn't come from the church. It didn't come from a divine appointment or anything like that. The power for governing comes from the people. And that's what you have to remember. There was also another contract that was talked about, another social contract that was introduced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said, while we're giving power to the government and establishing this contract between the two of us, we're also establishing a contract between all of us. This idea that we are all agreeing to allow this government to govern us, and we're also agreeing to give up some of our preferences, some of our desires for the good of the community as a whole. And what that means is you might have to give up something that you like, but it's not good for the whole community. So some of those minority, those people in the minority of decisions and stuff like that, they're essentially giving up a little bit of their freedom in order for this governing process to work. And that was the whole idea with John Locke and natural rights and Rousseau and the social contract. So this is going to start to influence people over in the colonies. Now, the Enlightenment pretty much hit the colonies in the 1740s and the 1750s. So right towards the end of this time period. What started a little bit sooner here in North America, in the English colonies, was a religious revival called the First Great Awakening. And we went through the reasons why this revival happened. We talked about that, that people had become disconnected from the church, that the younger generations weren't involved anymore, but there was this desire, there's this desire for God in our communities and stuff. And so you start to see these itinerant preachers traveling throughout the colonies and sharing the gospel and firing people up. And people were just, they were accepting Christ. They were accepting the faith. They were, bringing it into their families. They were bringing it into their daily lives. It was literally a full colonial revival. And the big thing about this, one thing I want you to remember, it was for everybody. It wasn't just for the, New England colonists or the Virginia colonists. It was for all the colonies, including the slaves. And so the slaves are going to be introduced to the opportunity, or presented the opportunity, to convert to Christianity. And a lot of them are going to do it during this time period as well. You're going to see the division between the old lights and the new lights. And the old lights was the established church who wanted to keep the status quo. And the new lights are going to introduce these new ideas. And the big thing that the First Great Awakening introduced to us, because the First Great Awakening was about a personal conversion, you making a decision within your heart to accept Jesus as your Savior. And that was something that you had to do. Your parents couldn't do it for you. Your government couldn't do it for you. It's a decision, it's a choice that you had to make. And we look at it from a religious standpoint, we're like, well, that makes absolute sense. But you can also look at it is that it created this idea of these democratic values, of that if I can choose my faith, if I can choose religion, if I can choose to follow Jesus, I can also choose who I want to govern me. I can also choose how I want this society to work. And so we started to see that those democratic ideals start to infiltrate into colonial society. The names you need to know: John Edwards, George Whitefield. George Whitefield, that's the guy I showed you the picture of. He's standing in the meadow with all the people around him. He's got his hands up, and that was, a camp meeting where he is sharing the gospel with everybody there. Was the Great Awakening affected by the Enlightenment in any way? No. And this is why I say no. These were two completely different movements, but they introduced the same ideas, if that makes sense. So the Enlightenment is telling us that we're the ones who give the power to the government. We're the ones who decide who we want our government to be. The Great Awakening is saying we have the power to choose what we believe. We have the power to choose our faith. And that is going to kind of go parallel with the idea of choosing our government, where they're going to merge in the 1760s and 1770s, when this idea of independent thinking, of being able to make these decisions ourselves and not having a government, not having a church tell us what we have to believe or what we have to do, but instead we can make that decision. So while the First Great Awakening and the Enlightenment didn't affect or didn't influence the other, they both came together to influence society as a whole. So I hope that answers your question. I hope that makes sense, because this is a big idea. And the First Great Awakening, it wasn't just here in the colonies. It started to spread over to Europe as well. So when we think about the First Great Awakening, when we think about the Enlightenment, think about not only here in the colonies, but it going across that transatlantic trade route. You know, like I said, so commodities are being traded, but ideas are being traded as well. Okay, so I think that's my last big idea. That is my last big idea. Don't look at this, because this is a preview for our next unit. Okay, that's everything. There are just 3 key points I want you to remember as you are preparing for the test tomorrow. When you look at time period 2, Miriam, what was the Great Awakening for a specific religion or Christian denominations? It was Christian denominations. It grew out of the New England region, but because of the independence of the thinking, you're going to see new denominations growing out of the Great Awakening. I know Roger Williams introduced the Baptist churches, but that's going to grow and that's going to spread throughout the colonies. Presbyterian is going to grow out of that. Methodists are going to grow out of that. So the First Great Awakening is going to inspire more denominations, because we are choosing how we want to worship. If we want to stick to the traditional form of worship, we can do that. If we want to go to a new form of worship where they use a different hymnal or they sing different songs, you can do that. They were all Christian religions, though. So that's the key point there. That's a great question. So when we look at the Unit 2, when we look at this, I said it was about comparing and contrasting, about seeing the similarities and differences between the regions, about understanding, the different economies and all this other stuff. But here's some big ideas. I would recommend you write these down, because they'll pop up and this will help you probably answer some questions. Politically, the one theme, the one thread that runs throughout this entire unit is the idea of self-government. All of the colonies had some form of self-government. So we're going to see it be birthed in the early colonies, and it's going to grow, and it's going to be available in all of the colonies. And a lot of that has to do with the distance from Great Britain, but a lot of it has to do with, you want local control. So self-government, big idea for this unit. Socially, I just mentioned the Great Awakening and the effect that had, and the idea of independent thinking and how important that was going forward. But socially, you're also going to see during this period the growth of slavery. That slavery is going to become the predominant labor force in our society. And I wrote a note here and I cannot read my writing. And during that time, because of the vast numbers of slaves that were coming into the colonies, their culture's coming with them, and they're going to be able to maintain their culture, through that covert rebellion, if you will. So, here's the thing. You can make me do whatever you can. Physically, you can make me do stuff, but you cannot make me change who I am on the inside. You cannot change my beliefs. You cannot change the culture that I hold on to. And we see that with the slaves throughout the colonial regions, whether there's the few that are in the New England or the many that are in the South. And then finally, economically, we are seeing through mercantilism and all this a shift to capitalism. All right, so we're shifting to capitalism. We're shifting away from feudalism and we're moving towards capitalism. And that's going to be the economic structure going forward, both here as well as over in the European countries as well. And that's based on mercantilism and all that stuff. So just remember, economics is about the shift to capitalism. Society is about the shift to independent thinking, as well as maintaining the culture of the slaves and honestly of everybody coming over. We still, we have all these different cultures in our society, and no one really gave up their culture to come over here. And then finally, politically, the idea of self-government throughout all of the colonies. So that is right there in time period 2, 1754 to, or 1607 to 1754, done in 70 minutes. So you guys have already thrown a couple questions. Does anybody have any other questions that I can answer for you before we call tonight, and you guys go and just review all this to ace your exam tomorrow? So I'll take a drink of water. See what Flynn is chewing. My God, there's so much trash underneath my desk from Flynn. Stupid. Yeah, whatever. I'm talking about you. Okay? All right, any questions? Let's see if I can get Flynn up here. Come here. Get up here. Come on. Oh, he's not coming up. All right, just another couple seconds here. Get up here. Come on. There we go. Here comes Flynn. All right. Flynn's making an appearance. Yay. I ate all my mom's papers. Yes. I love you. You're a good boy. Yes, you are. All right. All right. Okay, I don't see any other questions. I'm assuming that means you guys have it and you're going to ace it. Thank you for joining me this evening. Other than that, oh wait, question. Oh yeah, Julian, he's so cute. Gilligan won't jump up here, but he'll stick his head up. Gilligan, yeah. You see, there's Gilligan. Yeah, okay. All right, guys, have a wonderful evening. We will see you tomorrow. And 25 multiple choice questions tomorrow. That's what you're looking at. If you're not part of my class, I don't know what your teacher's doing, but I'm pretty sure they're going to ask the questions very similar to what I'll be asking tomorrow. All right. Have a great evening. Thanks again. Subscribe if you want to, because that just makes me look more important than I actually am. All right, guys. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.